Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today we're diving into the sometimes murky waters of philosophical categories, a topic that could be, well, a bit of a head-scratcher. But luckily for us, we have you, our listener. You're a philosopher gearing up for a big conference presentation on this very subject. And we've got your stack of articles and notes right here, ready to help you distill all this into something truly insightful for your talk.
Yeah, philosophical categories, they're fascinating. It really gets to the heart of how we understand and organize, well, everything, doesn't it?
It does. And it seems like philosophers have been wrestling with this for centuries. I mean, we have to start with the OG of category theory, Aristotle. He practically invented the whole field.
He really did lay the groundwork. And what's so interesting about Aristotle is, well, he wasn't just playing with words.
Right.
He really believed he was mapping out the real structure of the universe with his 10 categories: substance, quantity, quality, relation, and so on. He was a realist through and through.
Okay, I'm with you so far. But why 10? Why those specific categories? Did he just look around and say, yep, 10 seems about right?
Haha. Well, no, not quite. It's a bit more nuanced than that. I mean, he arrived at those 10 by analyzing how we talk about things, the kinds of questions we ask. But the real heart of his system, the part that gets really interesting, is the distinction between primary and secondary substances.
Ooh, you've piqued my curiosity. Break it down for us.
Okay, so primary substances are the individual things, like this particular tree, that specific cat.
Right.
But secondary substances are the broader categories those things belong to, so like tree in general, the concept of cat.
Got it.
And for Aristotle, you can't have one without the other.
So it's like you need those specific individual instances to even have a concept of that broader category.
Precisely. And this has huge implications for how we understand the relationship between individuals and universals, a debate that, still rages on in philosophy today.
Speaking of big debates, Aristotle also famously argued against having a single highest category, like being. Why was he so opposed to that idea? It seems pretty intuitive on the surface, right? I mean, everything that exists.
Right, it does seem straightforward. But Aristotle had some very clever arguments against it. See, he believed that to have a genuine category, you need to be able to define it with both a genus and a differentia.
Okay.
Like humans are the rational animal,
Yeah.
animal is the genus, rational is that differentia.
Oh, yeah, fall on.
But here's the problem. You can't say that the differentia itself belongs to that same genus. So if being was the highest category, then all the things that make things different, well, they wouldn't actually exist.
I see where you're going with this.
Mhm.
It would create a sort of paradox, right? Like the
Yeah.
very things that differentiate things wouldn't have the property of being. That is pretty clever. But let's be honest, even for a philosophy geek like me, this is getting pretty abstract. How does this all relate back to our listener and, their upcoming presentation?
It's a great question. I think understanding Aristotle's system, especially that point about primary and secondary substances, well, it helps to understand the fundamental challenges of categorization. It's not just about, coming up with labels. It's about understanding how our categories reflect or maybe even shape the very structure of reality.
It's not just semantics. It's about the relationship between concepts and reality. Now, we can't talk about categories without bringing up another philosophical heavyweight, Immanuel Kant. He took a very different approach, didn't he?
Absolutely. Kant famously shifted the focus away from, well, trying to categorize reality itself.
Right.
And instead focused on the categories of human understanding. He argued that we can't actually know the world as it truly is, what he called the thing in itself. We can only know it through the lens of our own, well, our cognitive faculties.
So instead of categories of being, we're talking about categories of how we think about being.
Exactly. Kant was interested in what he called the a priori categories, those concepts that are necessary for any possible experience. And like Aristotle, he also came up with a list.
Oh.
12 this time.
12. Okay. Our listener might need a cheat sheet for this one.
Don't worry, we won't go through all of them. What's important here is the implication this has for our understanding of knowledge. What Kant is saying is that the world we experience is already structured by our minds. Our categories aren't mirroring reality directly, they're actually shaping it.
That's a pretty radical idea.
Yeah.
So what we think of as objective reality is actually, in a way, a product of our own minds.
That's the essence of Kant's Copernican revolution in philosophy, and it really is a game changer for how we approach categories.
Okay, so we've gone from categories as reflecting the inherent structure of reality to categories as shaping our experience of reality. That's quite a jump. But before we move on, I think it's important to highlight why this is all relevant to a philosopher preparing for their presentation. I mean, it's one thing to grasp these ideas ourselves, but how can our listener effectively communicate these things to an audience?
That's a really good point. I think one way is to focus on the implications of each philosopher's view. For example, when discussing Kant, you could ask, if our categories shape our experience, does that mean there are multiple, equally valid ways of understanding the world? It's a thought-provoking question that the audience can grapple with.
I love that. It's not just about summarizing ideas, it's about teasing out the philosophical consequences. And speaking of teasing out consequences, I know we have another philosophical giant to cover. Edmund Husserl. He was a bit of a rebel in the world of categories, wasn't he?
He was. Husserl was a phenomenologist, and he brought that unique perspective to his study of categories. He was very careful to distinguish between categories of meaning, how we think about things, and categories of objects, the things themselves.
So he's recognizing that our mental maps might not perfectly match the territory, so to speak?
Exactly. And he went even further by proposing two dimensions of categorization, formal and material. Formal categorization focuses on the structure of things, abstracting away from specific content. But material categorization, that's about the essential nature of things.
Okay, so formal is about the framework, and material is about filling in the blanks with content. Can you give us an example to make this more concrete?
Sure. Consider Husserl's three material regions: nature, culture, and consciousness.
Like,
Nature, well, that includes physical objects and events. Culture encompasses artifacts, social institutions, values, things we create and imbue with meaning.
right.
And consciousness deals with, well, everything related to the mind: thoughts, feelings, perceptions.
That makes sense. And I can see how those regions are defined by the specific content they contain, not just by their abstract form.
Exactly. And I think highlighting those distinctions is really crucial for your presentation. Because Husserl, he provides a framework for analyzing not just the categories themselves, but also how we arrive at those categories.
It adds another layer of sophistication to the discussion. Okay, so far we've covered three major figures in category theory: Aristotle, Kant, and Husserl. It's really amazing to see how each one builds on and, well, challenges the ideas of those who came before.
It really highlights how philosophical thought has evolved, doesn't it? And we're not even done yet. There's a whole world of contemporary thinkers who have contributed to this really fascinating field.
My brain is starting to feel a little full. We've covered so much ground already. Maybe we can pause here and let our listener digest what we've learned so far.
Sounds good. Take a moment, listener, and think about what's resonating with you. What stands out as particularly relevant to your own work in philosophy? It's amazing how even these centuries-old ideas about categories are still shaping contemporary philosophical debates.
It really is. It's like we're building on the foundations laid by those philosophical giants.
Yeah.
And speaking of foundations, I know we have some more recent thinkers to explore, each with their own unique spin on categories. Where should we head next on our philosophical journey?
Well, one philosopher who definitely deserves a mention is Samuel Alexander. He was a bit of a throwback, actually. I mean, like Aristotle, he took a more realist approach to categories.
A realist
Yeah.
in a sea of idealists and phenomenologists. Now that's interesting. What was his angle?
Alexander believed that the ultimate reality, the bedrock of everything, was space-time. Not just space, not just time, but that unified concept of space-time. And he saw categories as, well, as emerging from the intrinsic nature of this space-time fabric.
Okay, I'm trying to wrap my head around this. So instead of substances or mental concepts, he's grounding his categories in the very fabric of existence. That's a pretty bold move.
It is. And he organizes his categories into three, what he called grades of increasing complexity. The first grade includes categories like existence, universality, relation, and order. The second grade adds substance, causality, quantity, and number. And finally, the third grade introduces motion.
So it's like each grade adds a layer of sophistication building upon the previous one. I can almost see this visually, like a branching tree of categories, all rooted in space-time.
That's a great observation, and it really speaks to the power of visualization when you're trying to present these really complex philosophical ideas. Something for our listener to keep in mind for their conference talk.
A well-placed diagram can go a long way.
Yeah.
Now, speaking of grasping concepts, where do more contemporary thinkers like Ingvar Johansson and Roderick Chisholm fit into all of this?
Well, both Johansson and Chisholm offer fascinating perspectives on categories, though they kind of diverge from Alexander's realist approach.
Okay, let's unpack that a little bit. What makes them stand out?
Johansson, he uses a method called successive abstraction to arrive at his categories. It's a process of starting with a specific thing and then gradually stripping away its particular details until you get to the most general category it falls under.
So it's like a process of refinement, peeling away the layers to reveal the core concept. Can you give us an example?
Sure. Imagine you start with, well, the specific shade of red we call crimson.
Okay. Crimson.
You abstract away from crimson to just red, then to color, and then finally to the category of quality. Each step takes you to a higher level of abstraction.
That's a really intuitive way to think about it. And what kind of categories does Johansson end up with using this method?
He arrives at 9 main categories, some with subcategories. Things like space-time, state of affairs, quality, substance, property, and so on. It's a very unique system.
A fresh perspective on an age-old problem. And what about Chisholm? What sets his approach apart?
Chisholm uses a more visual approach. He organizes his categories in a tree-like structure. So it's a hierarchical system with, well, a single most general category at the top, which then branches out into increasingly specific categories.
So, unlike Aristotle, he has a summum genus, a highest category that encompasses everything. What is it?
He starts with entity as that ultimate category, and then branches out into contingent entities, things that could have failed to exist, and necessary entities, those that must exist in all possible worlds.
I like the visual aspect of this. It really makes the relationship between those different categories so much clearer. I bet our listener could really make use of that tree structure in their presentation, to help the audience really see how these categories all fit together.
Absolutely. It's a great way to illustrate the inherent logic of a system, even if you don't necessarily agree with Chisholm's specific categories.
Okay, we've covered so much ground here. From Aristotle's 10 categories to Kant's transcendental idealism to Husserl's focus on meaning, and now the really unique approaches of Alexander, Johansson, and Chisholm. It's clear that there's really no one-size-fits-all answer when it comes to, well, categorizing reality.
That's right. And I think that leads us to a really important question. Is there even a single correct system of categories? Or is this whole project of categorization, doomed to fail from the start?
Ooh, now there's the big one. The skeptic in me wants to say it's all just a matter of perspective, like we're imposing order on a fundamentally chaotic universe.
Well, it's a valid point, and it's one that a lot of philosophers have grappled with. The sheer diversity of all those category systems that have been proposed throughout history, I think it's led some to embrace a healthy dose of skepticism about finding one definitive answer.
So maybe the focus shouldn't be on finding the right system, but rather on understanding the strengths and weaknesses of those different approaches.
Exactly. And this shift in focus, it's actually led to some really fascinating insights, particularly in the area of category differences.
Category differences. Okay, now this sounds like a whole new layer to this already very complex cake. Fill us in.
Instead of trying to build complete systems, some philosophers have really turned their attention to, well, to identifying the boundaries between different categories. So understanding what makes one category distinct from another.
So instead of trying to map out the entire territory, we're focusing on drawing clear lines between different regions. I like that analogy. It makes this whole thing feel a little more manageable.
Exactly. And this approach has, well, as we'll see, it's proven to be incredibly valuable for avoiding all sorts of philosophical mistakes and clarifying our thinking.
I'm hooked. Let's dive into the world of category differences. Who are the major players in this arena, and what are some of their key insights?
So we've talked a lot about how categories shape our thinking.
Right.
But what if it's the other way around? What if our categories are, shaping reality itself? It's a bit of a chicken or egg problem, isn't it? Do we impose categories on a world that's fundamentally unstructured, or are we actually discovering a structure that's already there?
That is the question.
That's the question. And I think it's an especially relevant question for our listener, the philosopher who is about to present at a conference.
Definitely.
Imagine ending your talk with that thought, leaving your audience to grapple with this idea. Are categories just a convenient fiction, something that we make up? Are they just a tool of the human mind? Or are they actually hinting at something much deeper about the nature of reality?
I like it. It would really get people thinking.
It's a great way to kind of highlight that enduring power of philosophical inquiry. We might not have all the answers, but asking the right questions can be just as valuable.
Absolutely. So to recap for our listener, while there might not be one single correct category system, understanding the different approaches to categories and that idea of category differences is really essential for clear philosophical thinking.
Couldn't have said it better myself. It's about equipping yourself with the tools to really analyze arguments and spot those hidden assumptions.
And to avoid those common philosophical pitfalls.
And who knows, maybe it'll even help you unlock some of the deeper mysteries of existence along the way.
Well said. Good luck with your presentation, listener. We know you're going to knock it out of the park.
Absolutely.
And for everyone else, thanks for joining us on The Deep Dive.
Until next time.
Keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.